Good evening. I'm James Roth, Deputy Director of the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum. On behalf of my colleague Stephen Rothstein, Executive Director of the Kennedy Library Foundation, and all of my library and foundation colleagues, thank you for coming this evening. I would also like to acknowledge the generous support of our underwriters at the Kennedy Library Forums, lead sponsor Bank of America, the Lowell Institute, and our media sponsors, the Boston Globe, Xfinity, and WBUR. I'm also delighted to welcome all of you who are watching tonight's program online. We look forward to a robust question and answer period this evening, and when Q&A starts, we will invite those of you who are joining us in person tonight to proceed to the microphones in the aisles to ask your questions. Professor Wood has kindly agreed to sign books after tonight's forum. Our bookstore has copies of his most recent book available for purchase if you're interested. And in honor of our week-long celebration of President's Day, and we at the library consider every day of the year to be President's Day, this evening's conversation will center on two of the Founding Fathers whose friendship, while sometimes contentious, is chronicled in Friends Divided, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. This was a friendship that was based on contrasts, as distilled down by Professor Wood's acute observation that, quote, Jefferson told the American people what they wanted to hear, how exceptional they were. Adams told them what they needed to know, truths about themselves that were difficult to bear, end quote. Yet in those truths, quote, there was nothing inspiring about it, nothing that could sustain a nation, end quote. And while in the end it was Jefferson's set of beliefs that held the nation together, it was both men's love for one another that allowed their friendship to endure. I'm now honored to introduce Gordon S. Wood, the Alva O. Way University Professor and Professor of History Emeritus at Brown University. He is the author or editor of numerous works that have a profound influence on our understanding of the American Revolution. Highlights include his 1969 book, The Creation of the American Republic, 1776 to 1787. An excellent read if you haven't read it. I've read it a couple of times, actually, I had to, for class. I'm not bitter. It was good. It did receive the Bancroft and John H. Dunning Prizes and was nominated for the National Book Award. His 1992 book, The Radicalism of the American Revolution, which won the Pulitzer Prize and the Emerson Prize. His 2009 book, Empire of Liberty, A History of the Early Republic, 1789 to 1815, which won the New York Historical Society American History Book Prize, and of course, Friends Divided, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, which he'll discuss tonight in more detail. In 2011, Professor Wood was awarded the National Humanities Medal by President Obama. I'm also delighted to introduce our moderator for the evening. Annette Gordon-Reed is the Charles Warren Professor of American Legal History at Harvard Law School and a Professor of History in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences at Harvard University. A renowned law professor and scholar of American history, Gordon-Reed has published 6 books, including The Hemmingses of Monticello, An American Family, in 2008, which won numerous awards, including the Pulitzer Prize in History as the National Book Award for Nonfiction. Her most recently published book, with Peter S. Onuff, is Most Blessed of the Patriarchs, Thomas Jefferson and the Empire of the Imagination. Her next book, A Jefferson Reader on Race, is forthcoming from Princeton University. Her honors include the National Humanities Medal, a Guggenheim Fellowship in the Humanities, a MacArthur Fellowship, and many others. Please join me in welcoming Professor Wood and Professor Gordon-Reed for this very special conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's great to be here. Great to be here with you. We always have conversations, but never in front of so many people. This is actually quite interesting. Friends Divided. Well, I thought I'd start by asking you, when you write, do you think about the current moment that you're in?
No. No, I'm back in the 18th century.
Back in the 18th century, you don't think that
I don't think about
you at all?
the present. No, the present has no obvious, at least to me, effect on my attitudes. Although I must say the ending of my book, I did take into account current events, but I was led that way by Lincoln, who may, I don't know how many people have read the speeches of Lincoln, but he, in 1858, on the eve of the Civil War, he talked about the heterogeneity of America. It's tribal, divided into ethnicities and different religions, and how you could hold these diverse peoples together. He could scarcely have anticipated how diverse we would become. But even he, in 1858, thought that the United States was a difficult nation to hold together. Not just sectionally. He was talking about all of these immigrants who had come in, and he names them: the French, the Swedes, the Germans, the Irish. And he said, how can they relate to the founders? And he said the reason they can relate is through the old Declaration of Independence. And that's when he gives all honor to Jefferson. And he said that phrase, all men are created equal, he says, makes them, and this is an extraordinary quotation that he used, or extraordinary phrase he used, blood of our blood, flesh of our flesh. We relate to the founders in that way because of the Declaration of Independence. And it's an extraordinary speech. And that, I think, is what led him to all honor to Mr. Jefferson, he said. And Jefferson has become a touchstone for us. Until recently, he was number one. Now, of course, he's in a lot of disfavor, but I think still commands the attention of most of them.
And that's how you end the book, thinking about our legacy, Jefferson's legacy to us.
Right.
As opposed to...
Certainly, I thought about both of them, and Adams, of course, has none of the celebrity status that Jefferson has. Jefferson has a memorial on the Tidal Basin in Washington. There's nothing like that for Adams. Monticello is a World Heritage Site visited by hundreds of thousands of people every year, and Adams' very modest home over here in Quincy gets only a fraction of those visitors, and actually, I was told, closes down in the off-season. So there's just a difference between them. And there was a difference back then. I mean, there was a wonderful, when they get back together after 1812 and they began exchanging letters, they exchanged 158 letters with Adams writing 3 to every one of Jefferson's. And he felt guilty about that, and yet Jefferson said, don't mind, I'm happy to receive your letters. And Adams said to him, well, you probably are much busier than I am. And he said, how many letters did you get last year? How many correspondence? And Jefferson said, well, I had 1,200 and something. And Adams said, my God. He says, I only had 120. So a tenth. He's only getting, see, Jefferson was a superstar, an intellectual superstar, a liberal superstar back in that time. He's corresponding with the Tsar of Russia, with Alexander, the great naturalist. And Adams is not in that league at all, celebrity league. And he's still not. And so there's just a difference between the two of them. And I think rightly so, because Adams was so cantankerous, so cynical about human nature, so realistic, you might say. He took on all of our myths by which we live. That is, all men are created equal, that the United States is exceptional. He denied all of that. And he could not really be the inspirer for a nation.
Well, you called Jefferson the child of light, and Adams, you don't call him the child of darkness, but he's the child of semi-light,
right.
Similar luminosity. How did they get to be friends if they were, you say that they're very, very different people, different personalities. How did they get to be friends, and what ultimately divided them?
Well, they got to be friends in the Continental Congress, the Second Continental Congress. Jefferson missed the first one because he became ill. He sent along a document which his colleagues then published. It became the summary view of the conflict. 1774, it was the most radical pamphlet yet to appear in the imperial controversy, in the imperial debate. And Adams loved it because he was the radical in the Congress, And that immediately bonded him with Jefferson. Jefferson joined the Second Continental Congress, and that's when they met. Adams, in the meantime, had been, of course, taking the lead orally in speeches, pushing the Congress towards independence. And he saw a fellow radical. The two of them were agreed on the need for independence and for reforming. Jefferson had all kinds of ideas of reforming his states. Adams wasn't so keen on that, but he was certainly keen on breaking from Great Britain. So that's what bonded them. What broke them, of course, was the French Revolution and the partisan politics that emerged in the 1790s when Adams became vice president and Jefferson was Secretary of State in the new Washington administration.
Yeah, we'll come back to that. But so they meet in the Second Continental Congress, and then they meet in Europe. They're together in Europe. Right. What about their different attitudes, their responses to their time in Europe?
Well, Jefferson, of course, was a Francophile, although he had some misgivings about the French when he saw them up close. But he nonetheless, thought that France was a wonderful country and would immediately, he hoped, would adopt republicanism and join the Republican ranks. Both of them are puritanical. They both are a little offended by the French attitude towards sexual relations, which both of them thought was a little licentious, especially John and Abigail were really astounded that someone like Franklin could sit around with a woman on his lap while her husband was right next to them. That kind of behavior appalled Adams. But Adams was fearful of France, fearful of the art, because he's a very sensuous man, Adams, much more sensuous, I think, than Jefferson.
And flesh that out.
He feared the effect of art, and he said this place is very dangerous for people because they're going to be taken in by the art. Adams was extraordinarily sensuous, and I'll give you an example. When he goes to Philadelphia in the Continental Congress, he had the practice on Sundays of going to the different churches. He had never seen a Catholic cathedral, and he's fascinated. He goes in and he sees a Catholic Mass, and he describes it to Abigail with all of the setting and the blood, he said, and the incense and the whole thing. And then he stops at the end and he says to her, "How did Luther ever break the spell?" He's attracted to this. This is the kind of statement that Jefferson would never have made. First of all, he never would have gone to a Catholic cathedral to experience it. He wasn't that interested in religion. Adams was, although they both were essentially Unitarians in their adult lives. But Adams was responsive to the art in a way, I think, that Jefferson wasn't quite as responsive.
So it was not just Abigail, John Adams, who was Jefferson's friend. Jefferson was quite friendly with Abigail as well.
Very much so.
An extraordinary person. So Jefferson's wife has died, so he's a widower at this point. But John Adams has a marriage that you describe as a companion marriage, and also he was a friend with Jefferson as well.
Well, in a sense, they adopted Jefferson. Adams, actually, he's only 8 years older, but he thought of Jefferson as a younger man, almost like his son. And and Jefferson, of course, deferred to Adams, which is why Adams liked him so much. And they brought him into their family, and Jefferson was fascinated by this family. He was fascinated by Abigail because he had never met a woman like her who managed the household, was all of that had all those skills, but at the same time was intellectually the equal of the two of them. She could command quotations from Milton or from other poets, Shakespeare, and she could talk to them as an intellectually. Jefferson, I don't think, had ever met a woman like her until he met Marie Causeway. So I think he took to this family, and he became a member of the family. They would take John Quincy, who was with him, the young boy, and they would go to a concert together or to a symphony. And so he became part of their family. That's when the real bonding took place, in the 1780s. And then, of course, when they were separated, Abigail and Mr. Jefferson exchanged letters and gifts. He flirted with her, mild flirtation. He said to him at one point, "I was going to buy a little statue of Venus for your dining room, but then I thought 2 Venuses in the same room would be a mistake." That little kind of, but she thought she said he is a choice one. She really admired him, and he admired her. The two of them were really quite close.
And they shopped. They were
shopped
shopping
together,
buddies.
that's right.
They
He
loved
bought
to shop.
things for her, and she bought things for him. Especially after they got separated, because John and Abigail went on to London as minister to London, and Jefferson remained in Paris as the minister to France. So they had an extraordinarily close relationship, and Abigail and Jefferson as well.
Different personalities, different responses to Europe, different ideas about constitutions as well. Did they?
Well, Adams was taken with the English Constitution, and he wanted to adopt the aspects of the English Constitution and apply them to the United States, to the state constitutions. That's what he focused on first. In fact, most Americans weren't much concerned with the federal level until 1787, but from 1776 on, that was the year of the state constitution making. And Adams wrote the most important pamphlet advising his fellow constitution makers about how their constitution should be structured. What he really wanted was an executive that had an absolute veto, because the King of England had an absolute veto. And he wanted a Senate, or an upper house. He didn't call it a Senate. He called it a council, which is what Massachusetts had, and a lower house of representatives. Adams had a tremendous influence on our Constitution and our Constitution making, both at the state and then later at the federal Constitution as well. He was not there. Neither man was there in Philadelphia. But Adams, because he had written the Massachusetts Constitution, which of course is still in existence, in 1780, that Constitution had a governor with a limited veto. Adams wanted a full veto, but he had to accept a qualified veto. That's the first governor to have that. And of course, when the Constitution makers in Philadelphia came to create the presidency and a Senate and a lower house, they had the Massachusetts Constitution as a model, and so the president has a qualified veto. And that, I'm sure, was based on the experience with Massachusetts, that's the best you could do. Adams was always felt that was a mistake. The governor should have had a full veto, could not be overridden, in other words. So the two of them, Jefferson accepted the idea of a bicameral legislature, which made him less radical than, say, Thomas Paine in that respect. But he certainly did not want a strong governor until he experienced the weakness of the gubernatorial office when he became governor of Virginia in 1779. He realized that the governor needed a little more clout, and so he changed his mind a little bit later. But he essentially was fearful of the executive. And he said to Adams said to him at one point, "You fear the one, I fear the few," meaning the aristocracy. So they differed in that. But Adams was, I think, very important in constitution making, and insofar as we have checks and balances, it's Adams who really pushed for those kinds of checks and balances.
And another difference between the two of them that comes through in the reading and from other things as well, that Jefferson really hated England.
Oh, definitely.
He hated the English. And
Adams is an Anglophile.
Well, so how did Adams maintain a sense of connection to Great Britain even after breaking from it? I mean, Jefferson thought that it should be brand new, we should do different things.
Right.
You know, the British Constitution, he loved it at one point, But then when he becomes disillusioned and revolutionary and he says, we're going to do something different, he wants to leave that behind. How did Adams keep the affection?
Adams felt that the English Constitution, once it was freed of its corruption, there's this famous story that Jefferson actually took notes on in 1790. There was a dinner party with Adams, Hamilton, and Jefferson. And Adams is going on about how the English Constitution is the best Constitution if only the corruption were removed. And what he meant by corruption was that the members of the House of Commons and the House of Lords were bought off by being given royal offices and sometimes cabinet positions. Now, if you think about it, that's the source of the parliamentary system that still exists in England. You have to be a member of Parliament in order to sit in the ministry. If you lose your seat in the House of Commons, you have to leave the ministry. So Adams saw that as corruption. Hamilton, who had a much clearer understanding of the English Constitution, said, no, the English Constitution is the best Constitution in the world with corruption. And he actually foresaw in some dim way the future of the English Constitution. Jefferson, of course, was appalled by this conversation. He thought both of these men are out of their minds. But Adams thought if you could just get rid of that corruption, the English Constitution had the perfect balance with a Senate, an upper house, a House of Lords, and then a lower house, the House of Representatives, and then balanced by a strong executive, or the crown. And so that was his model, and he was completely enamored of it. Jefferson was appalled and hated the English, and of course loved the French, and loved the French Revolution because he saw the French Revolution as a continuation of the American Revolution, a sister republic. And Adams was frightened and disgusted by the French Revolution, and saw himself as, when he read Burke, he said, that's my man, that's the view I have. Mm-hmm. He thought that the French were ill-equipped for republicanism. And of course, their relationship, when they got back together in 1812, their relationship was a strange one because Adams kept digging him. That's the way Adams was. He teased. We can understand it today. Two guys get along and they kid each other. Well, he kept doing this. Jefferson was not that kind of person. He's very polite, very restrained, and he would put up with these digs. At one, he would say to him, this is 1815. The French Revolution is kaput. Napoleon's been defeated. The Bourbons are back in the throne. And so what does Adams say to Jefferson? So, Mr. Jefferson, what do you think of the French Revolution now? That's the kind of digs that he would give. Mm-hmm. And Jefferson did not respond. He could not be provoked. He valued the friendship. They got back. It took so long. From 1800 to 1812, they never spoke to one another, never wrote to one another. Mm-hmm. So after 1812, and that was only because of Benjamin Rush, mm-hmm. Who worked for 2 years to bring these two men together. Mm-hmm. Jefferson put up with a lot of teasing from Adams. Uh-huh.
So the 1790s, you mentioned him, and we can't have any night without mentioning him, obviously, Hamilton. They both hated him, right?
That's right. That's the one thing they had in common.
They both
There's a bitter hatred of Hamilton.
Now, I understand why Jefferson hated Hamilton. I understand the different, the report on manufacturers, different understanding of a system of government. But Adams and Hamilton are Federalists. Right. They believe, they both believe in the British Constitution, corruption or not, but they were Anglophiles. So, but at the end, Adams hated Hamilton. Why did he hate him?
Well, Hamilton never was happy with Adams becoming president. He really did not want him to succeed to the throne, so to speak. As Adams saw his vice presidency was the first step. The only man he said I would serve under, meaning as vice president, would have been Washington. He says, so he thought it was natural that he should become president in 1796. Hamilton was not at all pleased because he saw Adams is somewhat erratic. He was volatile. He's excitable. He's not a steady Federalist. Adams did not like banks, did not understand banks, and certainly did not share Hamilton's view of turning the United States into a strong fiscal military state, which is what Hamilton wanted to do.
That's what Hamilton wanted.
Right, Hamilton wanted that.
So this thing about the lovable immigrant from
Miranda has made a there's another kind of Hamilton. Hamilton was a dangerous man. He was a Napoleonic figure. He really had grandiose visions for the United States. He certainly, we've turned him into and Miranda, he was an immigrant in the sense that he came from a Caribbean British colony, but his vision of what America should be, he's not a proto-capitalist, although they certainly solved the financial problem of the United States, but his aim was much more like Napoleon. He wanted grandeur. He believed in glory. And he's got an 18th century view of greatness. And he had all kinds of wild ideas about what he was going to do when he got a hold of this army that he was going to get in 1798, going down into Mexico and really making the United States even bigger and better in his mind. So he's a very dangerous figure, very much like Burr. And that's what makes the drama of their confrontation all the better. But Miranda doesn't get into that aspect of Hamilton. He's got another story to tell.
But Adams doesn't like Hamilton because he pegs him as
right. He actually accuses him of being a foreigner, which is unfair because Nevis was just as much a British colony as Massachusetts in 1750s when Hamilton was born. They were both born in British colonies, so they're not. He's no more of a foreigner than Adams was. They're both sources. Had a source in the British Empire, but he resents Hamilton's manipulations and attempts to replace him with somebody else as president. And then, of course, by 1798, Hamilton writes a pamphlet, which is supposed to be just for fellow Federalists, damning, in the most detailed way, saying this man is insane. He said things about Adams that most progressives are saying about Trump today. In other words, this man is totally unhinged. He's unable to function. He's dangerous. He's stupid. He's just wild. And all of these kinds of things. And obviously, Adams was furious at this kind of description. Adams was very erratic and did not see himself as a party man. He hated the idea of being part of a party. And so and he did not like the financial program that Hamilton was building. So he had real reasons to oppose the Hamiltonian program, although he was frightened to death of the Jeffersonian Republicans, who many people saw as a kind of fifth column for France. And in 1798, the danger of a French invasion was real to Adams and to many other Federalists.
So talking about the 1790s, we think about this as a very partisan time, a very, we're at each other's throats and so forth, a very difficult time. Talk a little about the 1790s. That was a time of discord as well. This obviously we end up with Jefferson and Adams as opponents during this time period.
The 1790s are far more partisan than anything we think we're experiencing now. And by 1798, we came as close to a civil war as we've ever done in our history, with the exception of the actual Civil War in the middle of the 19th century. So people can't appreciate just how fearful we were. We thought that the French were going to invade. After all, Napoleon was invading all over Europe. He'd been into the Holland and set up the Bavarian Republic. France was setting up puppet republics in Germany, in Holland, in Italy. And many people thought they were going to come across the Atlantic and with the help of a fifth column movement, that all of these quisling Jeffersonian Republicans set up a fifth column, set up a puppet republic here in the United States. At this point, 10% of the population was made up of French emigres, the population of Philadelphia, I should say, the capital, of emigres. And it was a frightening time, which helps account for the Alien and Sedition Acts, which, of course, have discredited the Federalists. I actually think this was the most frightening moment in our history, with the second most frightening may have been in early 1942, when we feared a Japanese invasion. And you know what we did in turning hundreds of thousands of Japanese, many of them citizens of the United States, not just aliens, but citizens. We were frightened of an invasion. Now, the invasion didn't occur, and therefore we feel terribly guilty and embarrassed by that. The same thing happened. The French did not actually invade, and therefore it makes the Federalist fears seem wrong-headed. But they didn't know the future. They didn't know that Napoleon was going to defeat, what's his name?
The Duke of Westminster.
No, at the Battle of the Nile, the hero of Trafalgar.
Nelson.
Okay.
Nelson. He's up on the.
Nelson's defeat of Napoleon at the Battle of the Nile destroyed the French fleet, and therefore ended the threat. That was October. Word of that didn't come until late in the year, October of '98, and then the whole fear collapsed, and the whole Federalist fears just went out the door. So. But they didn't know that ahead of time, and you have to appreciate the fears that Abigail and John had. Abigail was even much more of a hardliner than John in pushing for the Sedition Act.
And of course, this drives Jefferson to distraction. This drives Jefferson to distraction with all of this.
Definitely. He very much. He feels that these.
This is another thing that
Federalists
makes him, that he blames on
crazy, and he's completely in support of the French Revolution. He doesn't fear any invasion. He doesn't think they're going to invade, and he just wants. He thinks the Federalists are taking us back to monarchy, and there's a legitimate fear on the part of the Republicans as well, the Jeffersonian Republicans, because there are members of the Federalist Party who want to become closer to England. And here's Adams writing in his Daviler essays of 1790-91, where he says, look, our elections have become so corrupt, so faction-ridden, so partisan, that we're going to have a hereditary, eventually have to have a hereditary Senate and a hereditary president. He puts that in print. Jefferson had real fears that America was being returned to monarchy. And that drove the Republican Party, the fear of that. Historians have trouble accepting that.
Why?
Since it didn't happen, well, I find they think, well, it didn't happen, therefore they must have, I mean, good historians have said those Republicans were paranoid, and then other historians are saying, well, those Federalists are crazy because there was no French invasion. So you get, in the aftermath, we know what happened. It's just the same thing our view now of the Japanese internment. But you know who signed off on that? Earl Warren, Attorney General. FDR signed off on the internment of the Japanese citizens. So we have to realize, you have to get back to that time and realize how frightened people were. That's the problem of history, to recover the past, even though you're living in the present. It's very difficult to do.
So Adams has one term. What is the best thing that you think he did? We talk about his failures, but what do you think is the best thing he did?
And he said it was his greatest statesman-like action, was to, against all opposition from his party, send another delegation in the aftermath of the XYZ affair, which had been a disaster. The French had ridiculed our ministers and tried to bribe them and treated them with contempt. And so that we had withdrawn, and that's where we had a quasi-war with France. We're on the verge of war. We're exchanging gunfire in the ocean. Adams, in light of all of this, in the fear of invasion, all of this, he sends another minister thinking that maybe this will work, and it did. Unfortunately, he came back with a convention, that is a peace treaty, but it didn't arrive in the United States until after the election, which he had lost. I think if it had arrived earlier, he might have won that election, because it was it was close enough that he could have won if I think he had gotten that convention sooner. But that was a courageous action because it was opposed by everybody in his party, and therefore he had to defy his closest friends. I'm not sure if he even told Abigail. He didn't tell anyone. He just went ahead and did this on his own. Not something you want your presidents to do.
Regularly,
especially now.
Yeah.
So it was a erratic action, but a bold and courageous one, as it turned out.
And it also, something else that enraged many of the Federalists as well in Hamilton.
Oh, yeah. No,
and Hamilton was already, right?
Right.
Yeah.
But of course, it prepared the way for Jefferson's victory, and the Federalists were doomed from that moment on. They never acquired any kind of national reputation in the end, although they thought they would be brought back because this French president, which is what they called Jefferson, was designed. He was okay to be a college professor, but never to be president of the United States. And he fooled them and succeeded brilliantly.
Yeah. So Adams loses. Now, up until the time, can't do the whole of this, but they're fighting, they're sniping at this point, or through their surrogates.
Right.
Jefferson is actually supporting people who are writing some pretty nasty things about Adams during the end of the 1790s. Adams loses, and then he's kind of churlish in his treatment of Jefferson.
Oh, he's humiliated. He thought that it was a natural thing that he should be served the 2 terms the way Washington had, and he's just utterly humiliated. He refuses to attend Jefferson's inauguration. He was not the only president that turned his back on the successor. His son, John Quincy, did the same for Andrew Jackson. But he just was furious. And they never, after that, they never spoke with each other for 12 years. There was a brief moment in 1804 when Abigail writes a letter of condolence. Jefferson's daughter had died, and this had been the daughter that Abigail had known and had hosted in London when she came over with Sally Hemings. And Abigail writes a letter of condolence, and her own son had died recently, a few years earlier, and so she knew how he felt. And he was touched by this, and he wrote back a letter, a warm letter, but then he made a mistake of saying, you know, your husband and I have agreed on almost everything, and I have no quarrel with him. I mean, that was just disingenuous. They had terrific quarrels. But he was being polite. But then he says, there's only one thing that bothered me about his administration, were all those midnight judges he appointed. And it's true. Adams, after the election, he had lost it in November. In those days, the president didn't take office, and the new president didn't take office until March. So he had 4 or 5 months there, and he appointed a lot of judges. And it really irritated Jefferson and the Republicans. Well, that sent Abigail off, and she just came back hard against him. And for Mr. Jefferson, what about you? You did this. And he suddenly tried to defend himself another letter, and she just got more angry. And finally, he just threw up his hands. I can't deal with her anymore.
Yeah, no, she was a really tough woman.
She was tough.
I don't think I've ever seen anybody writing to Jefferson like that. I mean, it was just...
She was defensive of her husband. She just was going to defend him right to the bitter end. And it's too bad, because I think if Jefferson hadn't made that mistake of making any criticism, it might have led to something, but it didn't. And so they never spoke until...
So they go, Jefferson's president, a couple of terms, they're not dealing with each other anymore after this. And the other thing about this letter is that Adams did not know that they were corresponding.
That's right. He didn't know about Abigail's correspondence.
And in one of the last letters, he basically writes on the letter saying, I have known nothing of this correspondence between the two of them. So they're on the outs with one another. And how do they get back together?
Well, actually, you know, Adams is not a hard-line Federalist. He actually supports the Louisiana Purchase. Most of his Massachusetts colleagues were opposed to it, and it actually threatened secession. because they thought, oh my God, all these Western states coming in, they'll all be Republican states. And they quite rightly saw the future. And then, and John Quincy supports the Louisiana. He gets into the Senate as a Federalist, elected in those days by the Massachusetts legislature. And he supports the embargo, and as did Adams. Well, the embargo was a disaster for Boston and for the New England ports. And that irritated the Massachusetts people so much that they oust Adams from his Senate seat. And Adams becomes, John Quincy I'm talking about now, the son, he becomes a Republican. So in some sense, there's that background that allows Benjamin Rush, who worked at this mending the bitterness, he worked for 2 years to bring these two men together, telling each of them, the other one says he loves you. And Jefferson, and finally Adams says, well, that's enough for me. Or Jefferson says, that's enough for me. Adams makes the first move, sends a letter saying, I'm sending a piece of Massachusetts manufacturing. It turns out to be the 2 volumes of his son's lectures at Harvard. But Jefferson, being literal-minded as usual, says, oh, and he launches into his response, because the books didn't come with the letter, they came later. He thinks it's going to be a piece of manufacturing, so he launches into a long dissertation on manufacturing in Virginia. And then the books arrive, and he writes a quick letter, oh, I'm so embarrassed, but that broke the ice, and then the letters flowed for the rest of their lives until 1826. 158 letters, with Adams, as I say, writing 3 to every one of Jefferson.
Was Adams jealous of Jefferson?
Oh, very much so, especially over the Declaration of Independence, because in the 90s, the Republican Party began using Jefferson's authorship, as they say, of the Declaration, to use him to make him the leader of the Republican Party, and Adams is getting frustrated. He says, the author, he was the draftsman. If Adams could have known how famous Jefferson would become, he would have written the damn thing himself. You know, he said. And so he's very frustrated. And when the Mecklenburg, which is a phony declaration that came in 1775, anticipates Jefferson's words almost verbatim. It's obviously spurious, and Jefferson tells Adams that. But Adams is so excited by the possibility that maybe Jefferson copied somebody else's declaration, and he asks somebody to buy up 10 copies of the newspaper that reported this, because he wants to distribute to all his friends to show that Jefferson wasn't the real author of the Declaration. Then when Jefferson tells him it's spurious, he goes along with that. He accepts that. But he's very, very jealous of Jefferson. And he is, as I say, he's in another celebrity league. He's just not as famous as Jefferson. Even then, he knows, when he's told that Jefferson wrote 10 times, or had 10 times more correspondence than he did, he realizes, I'm not in that league.
So why didn't he wanted to be popular?
Oh, yes.
But
he doesn't have the personality for it. I mean, he's irascible, he's cynical. Although I think once you broke through the crustiness, he could be as warm-hearted, and everyone says that, including Jefferson. James Madison never understood what Jefferson saw in Adams. And Jefferson has to explain to him, he says, look, once you get to know him, he's really a nice guy. And Madison just shakes his head and says, no, I can't take it. I just can't take him. He's too egotistical, too vain. He's too erratic. He's volatile. He's just not somebody that Madison could deal with. But Jefferson could, and he saw something in Adams that others who got to know him felt the same way. Franklin never quite, he got to know him, but he always thought that he was wise man. What did he say, that famous phrase, he's wise and he's...
But absolutely out of his mind.
But sometimes absolutely out of his mind. Right.
Yeah. So he wanted to be known. You know, he resented Jefferson's authorship of the Declaration of Independence, but they had different ideas about what that meant, what that document meant.
Right. The phrase "all men are created equal," of course, was liberal, conventional wisdom in 1776. By 10 years later, Adams is denying it. Men are not created equal, he says to Jefferson. No more than the United States is an exceptional nation. Of course, Jefferson invented the notion of American exceptionalism. But Adams says, see, Jefferson and most liberals in 1776, and I think in the generals right through that whole period, are all believers in nurture, not nature. They literally believe that all men are created equal, and the differences that emerge are due to different environments, that different training. And that's why education becomes so important to someone like Jefferson and to other Americans and to us today. Despite all of our talk about genes and DNA, which they didn't know about, we still, as Americans, believe strongly, I think, in that Jeffersonian belief that environments are crucial. Well, Adams wouldn't have any of it. He said all men are created unequal. And he says to Jefferson, I was in a foundling hospital in Paris, babies 4 days old, and I could see they were all unequal. Some were beautiful and some were ugly. Some were smart and some were stupid. At 4 days, he said, and that remains the same. Education can do very little to change that. That's not an American view. And that separates them more than anything. Adams believed in nature, not nurture. And that is not what Americans want to believe or can believe. And he denied that America was exceptional. He said, we are just as corrupt, just as sinful, just as vicious as every other nation. There's no special providence for the United States, Adams says. Jefferson says, no, we are a chosen country, and we have a special responsibility to bring democracy or republicanism to the rest of the world. They really divide on that, and they divided on everything else, too. Jefferson was not much for religion. He had no religious sensibility to speak of. Adams did, although they're both Unitarians in their beliefs. Adams had a respect for religion that I don't think Jefferson had. So they differ on almost every single thing, except the rightness of the American Revolution and their hatred of Hamilton.
So with all of that, what does John Adams have to say to us? He became this sort of lovable figure in the McCullough book and in the miniseries. Although in the miniseries, he wasn't as lovable as he is in the book. I mean, I remember watching that thinking, now why are we supposed to like this guy? You know, through the rest of it, why are we watching this? I mean, what does John Adams have to say to us?
I think for us Americans, I think he as I say, he created, he was cynical, he's fearful of power. He created our checks and balances. I think we need that fear of that assessment of human nature that people aren't all good. Jefferson was an optimist, and he really had a positive view of human beings. He felt that if you could just remove the monarchical influences, people are naturally good and they'll reach out to one another. They actually can love one another. Adams would not believe that. He thought that was hogwash. We're suspicious of one another, and rightly so, because people aren't out for good purposes, good motives. So he said you should never have any power without a check. I think that's something helpful to have. You need checks and balances, and you need checks on power, political power in particular. And so if you believe that, then you're with Adams. He contributed that to our system. But all of our positive things, our optimism, our belief in America and its right role in the world, that's Jeffersonian. And if you believe that all men are created equal and that the environment has to be transformed in order for people to reach their full flourishing, then that's Jefferson. So I think that's the difference between the two of them.
Have you changed your views about the two of them over the course of your career? When you're thinking about the creation of the American Republic, did you have one view about Adams? Is it pretty much the same as it is now?
No, I didn't have a full understanding. When I first started this book, I just finished editing 3 volumes of Adams's writings for the Library of America, and I was going to write a book on Adams.
How did you come to do that?
Huh?
How did you come to do that?
Well, because Adams hadn't been done. He was the only founder that, the Library of America has a volume for Washington, Jefferson, Madison, Franklin. Where's Adams? Well, they agreed to do it, so I got 3 volumes. Actually, Franklin only has 1 volume, Jefferson only has 1 volume, Adams has got 3. So that he gets back at them that way. But I was going to write on Adams, but then my publisher, Scott Moyers, who's president of Penguin, said, "Why don't you compare him with Jefferson?" And I'm so glad he suggested that, because I think I understood them better by pitting them against one another, especially on this issue of all men are created equal. I wouldn't have appreciated how different Adams was if I hadn't also tried to focus on Jefferson. And so I think I understood both of them better by pitting them one against the other.
So when you wrote The Creation, am I wrong, and did you suggest that he was irrelevant?
Oh, well, he is irrelevant in his ideas of estates. He manages to hang on to the British old world notion that you have orders or estates of the realm, like the Third Estate in France. It's an order, and he never understood that the Senate in America had become a kind of representative body. Now, at the outset, that was not true. Yeah. We created, in our first state constitutions, houses of representatives and then senates. Well, does that mean the senates were not representative? Well, they weren't at the outset in 1776, and that's how Adams saw it. But by the time you get to the late 80s, it's not possible to think of the Senate in that way. Let me give you an example of what I mean. In Philadelphia, in Pennsylvania, they had a unicameral legislature in 1776, considered very radical. Adams was appalled by it. Now, there were people in Pennsylvania who wanted an upper house because they thought that was when you have a balanced government. And so they lobbied for it, to have that change, to create a second upper house. And the opponents said, the defenders of unicameralism said, "No, you're trying to foist a House of Lords on us." And they said, no, that's not what we're doing. We're just creating a double representation of the people. Wow, that's just a new thing. Can the people be represented twice? Well, maybe then they could be represented 3 times or more. And that's exactly what happened. Americans began, by the 1780s, within a short time, they're talking about all parts of the government being representative. And in the Massachusetts Constitution, even though Adams wrote it, he left in 1779, he never got to write the introduction to the Constitution that the convention turned up. And what did they do in the introduction? The people he left behind, he went back to Europe. They said, the governor of the state is a representative of the people. Everybody's a representative of the people. And that's what happened. And now we think of our senators as, they're peculiar, they're smaller in number, they have longer terms, but they're just as much representative of the people. Well, that's not what Adams thought at all. He thought they were a separate estate, that they were like the House of Lords, and they're not representative of the people. Well, in that sense, I meant he was irrelevant to American political theory. Well, that got picked up and used in ways I had not intended.
Well, it happens often. That definitely happens.
Right.
But your view has changed. You feel that from doing this book and over the years, your understanding of his...
Our understanding of Adams.
Adams
has and Jefferson, too.
And Jefferson as well. What's the most surprising thing that you learned here? Was it the point about
It was about the difference over equality.
Equality, that was the thing.
I found that Adams was so insistent on that. The inequality, and of course he could explain the inequality of of the society that way, because he says that's built into human nature, and you're not going to be able to change that. And so he had a kind of iron law of oligarchy. There are always going to be a few people who run things, and they're not going to be the best people. Mr. Jefferson thought that, well, once you get a democracy, then the people, of course, in their wisdom, will elect the best people. They've always elected me, is the way he put it. Adams, of course, didn't feel that way and felt that the people who are going to get to the top aren't going to be the most virtuous. They're not going to be the best people. They have to be the wiliest, the richest. And so he had a very cynical view of what's going to happen. But he said that the few will always be the most dangerous in your society. That's why there's a new book out called John Adams and Oligarchy. He did anticipate what we might call the 1%, or the few that seem to dominate our society. And he said you can't get away from that. And Jefferson, in his optimism, said no, the few will be, as long as they're elected, they'll be okay.
So in the end, did they finally explain themselves to one another, do you think? And they say that they should have. Do you think that they actually
Probably
succeeded?
Probably not. The one issue they didn't get into very deeply was slavery. That came up in the Missouri Compromise and the Missouri Crisis. And Jefferson mentions it. He's really scared by that Missouri Crisis. And Adams is aware of it and tells other correspondents, I didn't really push him on this. I don't have any truck with slavery, and I've never owned a slave. But his view was, I'm going to leave it to those Southerners who have the problem to solve it. I'm not going to preach to them what they should do. That was the view he took, hands off. But he realized how sensitive an issue it was, and he knew that's one thing he couldn't tease Jefferson about. He could tease him about the French Revolution, but he couldn't tease him on slavery. He sensed that. And of course, the last few years of Jefferson's life, from 1819 on to 1826, are a nightmarish time for Jefferson. I think he's not the same optimist anymore. And both of them are frightened of the breakup of the Union over slavery. They anticipate, if it comes, it's going to come over that issue.
And both of them are pessimistic. You would say that they ended their lives as pessimistic, both of them?
Both. In a peculiar sense, Adams is a little more optimistic because his son has become president of the United States.
Yeah.
So, but that appalls Jefferson, because he says John Quincy's got this plan for internal improvements, meaning roads and canals, and he says if they can do that, if the federal government can do that, they can interfere with slavery, and Jefferson becomes a real fire-eating Southerner, frightened of the federal government and what it might do to Southern institutions. And Adams is a little more optimistic. Of course, he doesn't realize his son is going to have a disastrous presidency. He dies halfway through his son's presidency.
And their end?
They ended, of course, as you all probably know, died on the same day, the 50th anniversary of July 4th of the Declaration of Independence, the Jubilee celebration. Now, there's a little manipulation there because, as Jefferson says to his doctor, is it the 4th yet? And the doctor says no, and he says, oh, hang on a little while longer. And Adams, the same thing. They're really trying, they know they're both dying, and they can, to some extent, will it. And so there is that, but they neither knew, they're 500 miles apart, they don't know what the other is doing. Adams apparently said, as he's dying, he says, Jefferson still survives, and of course, Jefferson had died 5 hours earlier. But in a larger figurative sense, of course, Jefferson, he was right about that. Jefferson does survive in a way that he doesn't.
Yeah. Gordon, thank you very much.
My pleasure.
And now, another great part of the evening, we have time for questions. There are microphones here in the middle of the aisles. Surely, make your way there.
We can't see you at all because the lights are so bright.
Now we can.
Although, I don't know if you can elaborate on this a little bit more, but when I've been studying this period, there's this note that just gets mentioned, and there's no other details or context, but when Adams...
We can't hear
Oh, can you hear me better? Is that better?
Yeah, that's better.
When there's a story that I would love for you to elaborate on, I don't know if you know much about it, but I read it in a couple of books, where Adams is in London, Jefferson visits, and they go see Shakespeare at Stratford-upon-Avon. Do we know anything about what they saw, what they thought about it? Did they talk about it at all? It seemed like a nice little gem, but I'd never heard that elaborated upon.
Well, Jefferson joins Adams. Well, Adams is minister to Court of St. James, and they tour like tourists. They do go to Shakespeare. I don't recall what they said.
Jefferson supposedly kissed the ground.
Yeah, Jefferson would have appreciated it more maybe than Adams. But what was interesting is that Jefferson wants to see all the gardens, whereas Adams wants to go to all the battle sites of the 17th century, all the fights for freedom and anti-Cromwell or Cromwell versus the king. So they have a different interest. Jefferson is taking notes because he wants to apply that. But I forget what they said about, they do go to Stratford-on-Avon and they make some remark about Shakespeare, but I can't remember what
Exactly
Adams
what
said
it is.
about
The master or whatever, but kissing the ground and that, this is,
They both,
he loves
they
Shakespeare.
both read Shakespeare, both quote from him from memory in many cases, of course.
Did Jefferson ever visit Quincy and visit Adams at his home? And did Adams ever visit Jefferson at Monticello? And what, if anything, do you think, after researching and writing the book, that the two houses, how they're so different, say about both men?
They never visited. Jefferson never came to Quincy, and Adams never saw Monticello. They're just, that reveals so much. I mean, Monticello is Jefferson's creation. I mean, it's a magnificent building, a World Heritage Site, a strange building in a way. I mean, it's a bachelor's building. You ever seen the staircase to go up for the guests? I mean, it's not like other Virginia homes. It's not hospitable for guests. They have to go up this small winding staircase. Adams's house is very modest. When the French minister, or one of the French, he may have been the consul, sees it, he says, well, my God, this is so, I mean, it's so unbecoming. It's sort of a summer house for a third-class lawyer. That's what this house is like in France. So the two houses are very different in the eyes of others, and I think for Americans today. One's a middling sort of house, a middling sort of, he's well-to-do in a sense by Massachusetts standards, though Adams was never the richest man in Massachusetts, and it bothered him. I mean, because he was looked down upon by many of the other Brahmins, especially his background. His ancestry was not up to what some of the other Brahmins thought. So he has that part of his resentment of the few, of the aristocracy, comes from his experience in Massachusetts. He's never fully accepted by the Massachusetts elite, especially from the North Shore, from Essex Junto, the Essex Junto he referred to.
Yeah. And there was a house on top of a mountain, Monticello.
Yeah, right.
Shaved off top of a mountain.
I mean, it's a strange house, Monticello, and that he would build it up there. I think it's symptomatic of Jefferson's view of himself. He was above the society. He wanted to be apart from it. He saw himself as superior. I mean, it's a strange thing to build a house where it's difficult to get water, and everything has to be dragged up this mountain. But he saw himself as standing apart from the society. And when he comes to explain the society to William Wirt, remember that he writes a series of letters to William Wirt, who's writing a biography of Patrick Henry.
Just
in
hysterical letter.
1810 or so. And so Wirt writes to Jefferson, tell me about Henry, tell me about the society then. And Jefferson's description of society breaks it down into levels. And he never puts himself, you don't know where he stands in that society. It's almost as if he's apart from his description, that he's above everything. It's an extraordinary series of letters that he writes. Jefferson yet he's deeply respected by his colleagues, because I don't think there's any man in America who knew more about more things than Thomas Jefferson. And I include Franklin in that, in North America. I don't think there's anyone who knew as much about more things than him, than he did. And they respected him. But they don't go, he has all kinds of ideas, they stifle them left and right in the House of Delegates, in the House of Representatives. They just don't follow out what he wants to do, and he really is working to abolish slavery. He's got all kinds of reforms. He's read Beccaria, the Italian jurist, and he wants to do reform of the law. He has all kinds of education, all kinds of plans, which generally speaking are not implemented, except for the religious one. Finally, Madison engineers that, and that's a great accomplishment, and that's one of his three, what's interesting, he puts on his tombstone, first, author of the Declaration of Independence, and then also the Bill for Religious Freedom, and then UVA, the creation of University of Virginia. But he never mentions his presidency as his three great accomplishments.
Yes, Professor Wood, thank you. I was very struck by your contrast between Jefferson the optimist and Adams the pessimist. And I think Jefferson did apparently strike the national chord more firmly in that respect, and we remain optimists, although it gets us into a lot of trouble sometimes. My question is, do you see any other figures, great figures in American history, who you would say share some of Adams' pessimism or healthy skepticism or whatever we want to call it?
Well, that's a good question. I don't think anyone was quite as, someone like Lincoln was a realist about human nature in a kind of a brooding sense, but he looked to Jefferson to offset that. Himself, he was not Jeffersonian. He's not a hail fellow Mel. He wasn't somebody who is, you'd say, was an optimist. But he looked to Jefferson to offset his own gloominess, if you will. But I don't think a person like Adams could get elected as president. Maybe we have one with Trump in the sense that he's erratic and volatile, but Adams was better than that, I think. I don't think anyone after Adams was quite as cynical. You couldn't get elected if you said the things he said. We're going to have a hereditary Senate or a hereditary president. No, I don't think it's been any president. Maybe, yeah.
No, I can't think of anybody. And I was just wondering, as you're saying this, I was going to ask you this before about Puritanism, about New England. Well, does this shape his character?
Yeah, I think it did. He comes out of that tradition, although he himself is not a Puritan.
No, he's not a Puritan, but
he's as I say, he's a Unitarian in his beliefs, but he's shaped by the Puritan outlook on the world, I think, and he respects his ancestors and their Puritanism. Even when Jefferson makes fun of them, he defends them.
I have two short questions. One involves the Declaration of Independence you just spoke about, and the other is about pessimism. When Jefferson first drafted the Declaration of Independence, he blamed slavery on the English king. The English king inflicted slavery on the Americans, and it was an evil. However, it got deleted out of the Declaration of Independence. How did Jefferson get from blaming slavery on an English king to what happens later in his life?
Well, the Virginians were eager to end the slave trade, largely because they had more slaves than they knew what to do with. And he thought that ending the slave trade might be the first step to ending slavery. So and the Crown vetoed Virginia's efforts to end the slave trade for the colony of Virginia. So in that sense, the Crown is responsible for slavery. But other members of the Continental Congress realized that there was a lot of participation in the slave trade, particularly from northern states like Massachusetts and Rhode Island, that it was embarrassing to push this point too far, that it was the Crown alone that was responsible. So it got cut out of the Declaration. But Jefferson always felt that that would have been a first step towards eliminating slavery. And of course, the elimination of the slave trade built into the Constitution, a 20-year hiatus, was, in the eyes of many people, the first step to eliminating the institution. Little did they realize that slaves were reproducing at virtually the same rate as in Virginia as whites, and that Virginia's leading export by 1820 and 30, the 1820s and 1830s, were slaves, sending them to Mississippi, Alabama, deep south. Virginia couldn't grow cotton. Tobacco was dying. The soil wouldn't take it. So really, Virginia is a dying economy living off of slave exploitation. So it's no wonder they wanted to end the slave trade. It's an interesting fact. I'll just mention this. I don't know if anyone's ever picked this up, but when the Confederacy occurs in two stages. The Lower South goes out, and they draw up a constitution. They prohibit international slave trade. Virginia's outside of the Union, outside of the Confederacy. Virginia cannot ship slaves to Mississippi and Alabama anymore. This is an inducement to get Virginia to join into the Confederacy, which they do. I don't think that's the reason Virginia does, but it certainly was an economic inducement because Virginia really was dependent on the export of slaves.
Here's a second very quick point, not necessarily that serious, but what is your response to Alan Taylor's review? In the end, Mr. Wood casts Americans as needing consoling illusions because they cannot face stubborn facts. If so, the true pessimist is not Adams, but Mr. Wood.
Well, there's some truth to that. We do live by myths, and every society does, I think, and that's been ours. We're optimistic people, generally, and we have... as President Polk said, the United States is the only country in the world that has its history in the future. And that's how we think. And that's what keeps us going. And so in that sense, Alan was right about it. I wouldn't call them illusions so much as these are ideals, dreams. We're not equal, but we hope to be. And that keeps us going, and that drives us on. And those are important beliefs. I wouldn't call them illusions.
Hi. I am a high school history teacher, and I guess I haven't done Jefferson a lot of favors. Look, can you hear me?
Yeah, now I can.
I teach high school history, and I really liked your comment on how Adams said all men aren't created equal, and Jefferson says all men are created equal, but how do you reconcile that ideal with the fact that he owned slaves? And teaching high school, it's really hard for them to embrace this wonderful idea of Jefferson because he was a slaveholder.
Well, in Jefferson's case, he did not believe that Africans were equal. But he's the exception. Actually, many of his colleagues, slaveholding planters, did believe they were equal. They understood that their environment was not conducive to making them equal. But somehow, and many of them thought that the blackness of the Africans was due to being scorched by the African sun, and that in the more temperate climate of the United States, that they would whiten through time. I mean, these are the kinds of views that were trying to use. But Jefferson, look, you have to understand, his words and his ideals transcend his weakness as a person. I mean, that's understandable. His words and what he said are more important than the man himself. And that's possible for two things to be. I don't think you want to use the weaknesses and the imperfections of the man to poison the great words, because those words are inspiring, and Lincoln saw that and made. I mean, Lincoln knew that Jefferson was a slaveholder, but he said all honor to Mr. Jefferson. And he used him to mobilize support in the North to fight, to deal with the problem of slavery and to fight the war. So I think we have to separate the man from the words.
And certainly the Confederacy believed he believed that. Alexander Stephens, and you probably use with your students when they talk about the Cornerstone speech, he basically talks about the Declaration and talks about Jefferson and says they're wrong and they're not created equal, and then that becomes the basis of their understanding of their new Constitution. So Gordon is right. It's the words that really, what people made of the words, and they made different things of them. One, for Lincoln, we're going to have a new birth of freedom. For the Confederacy, we reject those notions.
You spoke of their philosophical split in the 1790s. I was wondering if you had any comments on Jefferson sort of being the leader of this increasingly disloyal opposition while he was serving as vice president.
Well, actually, it's Madison who takes the leadership, but Jefferson, because of he's just a more superstar, because of the Declaration in particular, becomes the anointed leader. But it's Madison who's actually doing the organizing of the party. It starts as an interest group focused on Virginia, led by Virginians, and Jefferson is sort of anointed as the leader. But he takes that up because he's a very astute politician, far more astute than Adams. I mean, during the election of 1796 and also in 1800, Jefferson's there like a modern politician. What states are coming in for this? What electoral votes are going to... Adams is totally oblivious of all that. He just doesn't seem to care. So Jefferson is by far the better politician. Now, what's interesting to me when you think about it is the Republican Party is the party of the people. It's the plebeian party, but its leadership is exclusively with Southern slaveholding planters. I mean, the paradox. These are, you'd have to say, limousine liberals in extreme. I mean, it's just unbelievable that the leadership of the popular party should be made up of slaveholding. And the opposition, the Federalists, coming from Massachusetts, the more egalitarian, the more democratic state. Now, the paradox is explained because the Republicans in the South don't fear democracy. They're in a hierarchical world and they dominate it. In Massachusetts, the leaders here aren't so sure. The people are, they revolt they're unruly and they revolt in Shays' Rebellion and so on. So they're much more suspicious of democracy, even though they are in a more democratic, or because they're in a more democratic and egalitarian state.
And it's interesting because Jefferson, one of the things was very much envious of New England. He liked the fact that they had an opportunity to do town meetings and so forth. So it is a weird setup.
His granddaughter marries a Massachusetts man or a Northerner, a Yankee, and she comes up here and she writes back to him, Dad, look, they've solved the problem. We got this stain. She goes through these Connecticut towns, little Massachusetts towns, and she just loves it. And she explains it to him. And you're quite right. You used it in your book, that many of his descriptions of the town meeting or the small ward republics sound like a New England town meeting. And it's true. There's a jealousy of what New England has, particularly the fact that it has no slaves. Or by 90 and 1800, 1810 when his granddaughter's here, there are no slaves.
And public
left.
education.
I'm curious if you've ever seen 1776 and what your opinion of that and sort of other depictions
Have you
of
heard
their
of have you seen
relationship.
1776?
Oh, the old Broadway show? I've seen the movie.
Right.
It's it's terrific. I think it's great. It's kind of it was that generation's version of Hamilton. Right. Adams comes across as if I remember correctly, he's a quasi-comic character, but he's the one pushing for independence. Right?
Wonderful way to spend an evening. By the way, I was planning to ask you if you would speak a little bit about John Adams' attitude towards General Lafayette from France. Washington and Jefferson admired him. Why not Adams?
Lafayette. What did Adams think about Adams?
Because Lafayette's one of those French philosophe types who's got he's a head in the clouds. Has no sense whatsoever. He's dreaming about his revolution and of course Lafayette was one of the plotters of the revolution, little realizing that he would become its victim. He escaped with his life. I mean, he was lucky he got out. He would have lost his head if they'd caught him. So Adams has nothing but contempt for these dreamers, these utopians who think that they're going to change the world. I mean, Adams is a real conservative. He just thinks people who try to change the world are going to end up with something worse. And Lafayette is a good example in his mind. A kid who just didn't know what was what. He didn't know reality. That was the view he had of all these French philosophes, many of whom did get guillotined or stoned to death, as one of them did by Paris mob. So Adams has nothing but contempt for all the Frenchmen. They just think they're just ill-equipped to govern themselves. It's his view.
I've read that the 1800 election was the first political campaigns that were considered dirty campaigns in the United States. Would you comment on the role that Jefferson and Adams played in the dirty aspects of their campaign and how it affected their relationship?
It was probably the most scurrilous election in our history. It's hard to think of that but it was. But the two principals, of course, stayed in their homes and did nothing. They did no campaigning. But Jefferson was encouraging his followers. I don't think he wanted them to say nasty things about Adams, but he certainly wanted them to organize and to promote the Republican Party and the Republican interest, because the stakes are high for Jefferson. This is not ordinary politics. And we make a mistake if you go back and interpret the 90s as, well, those are the two parties like our two parties. Neither of them accepted the legitimacy of the other. And the Federalists never even saw themselves as the party. They were the administration, and it's the parties, the Republicans, who are threatening the government. Now, Jefferson did see himself, his Republicans, as a party, but it's a temporary one, only mobilized until we get rid of these monocrats. Once the threat of monarchy is over, then the Republican Party can disappear. And that's what he thought would happen after his election, and it didn't happen. But that's what his hope, that finally we would do away with parties once we got the Republic on firm ground. So it's not, don't want to think of it as politics like our own, but the bitterness was very great. And Jefferson is organizing in a way that Adams was not capable of doing that. I mean, it's just personally, or he didn't have the support of his fellow Federalists. It's amazing that he got as many electoral votes as he did. He certainly was not doing any planning. He was not capable. I mean, temperamentally capable of doing that. Jefferson was a very astute politician and was aware of what was happening. And he had his aide. I mean, Madison was even better. And the two of them were a real team. and a political team. But the stakes were high for them. This was not just winning an election. This is saving the country from monarchy.
Thank you for a very informative evening. Hamilton is coming, the theatrical production, this coming fall to Boston, and I see it as a major teachable moment. You had referenced it both earlier, that there's a certain entertainment spin to it. I was curious how how each of you as historians would round out our knowledge of Adams, Jefferson, and Hamilton's relationship, so that after having my kids see Hamilton, I could sort of fill out a little bit more of the accurate historical context.
Well, I think it's good. I mean, I think the play was a sensation because it got a lot of kids interested in the American Revolution that otherwise wouldn't be interested, and I think that alone is worth. And of course, Miranda is a genius. The hip hop and the dialogue is just wonderful, and you can. I mean, before you go see it, you should listen to the disc because. Okay, I'm sure. I mean, obviously, Hamilton is a much more complicated figure than Miranda has. He wanted to emphasize the fact that he's a newcomer, that he is a self-made man. He has no background. He comes as an orphan, essentially, without anything but his brains, and he's a smart guy, and that really, I mean, he wants to go through Columbia or King's College in three years, and they tell him, no, you can't do that. No, he went to Princeton to do that, and Witherspoon there says, no, you can't come here. We have our certain regular, and so then he goes to King's and goes through faster. I mean, it's just a flaw, how should I put it? It's not a full picture that you get of Hamilton from the play. You have to see him in 1798, 99 when he's contemplating, the army, there was 50,000 men voted by the Congress. He's going to be the commander-in-chief. In fact, Washington is dragged out of retirement, but he wants Hamilton to be the de facto commander. I mean, that was a crisis moment. And Hamilton has visions of what he's going to do. He's going to march on Virginia. He's going to break up Virginia, break up the state. It's too big, too powerful. And it's true. Virginia was the most powerful state this country's ever had. No state has ever been more powerful than Virginia was in the early republic. So Hamilton's got a kind of view of the world that's a little scary, Napoleonic kind of view. And he's going to be the commander. The army's going to move south into Mexico, to South America, and I will be in command of it, he tells Rufus King, who's minister in England. He's bragging about what he's going to do. Now, it all goes kaput, but he's not completely, he's a dangerous man, let's put it that way.
Yeah. I did a freshman seminar this past fall, Hamilton and Jefferson. And the only thing I could tell you to do is just to look at history books. I mean, that's the main thing, is to sort of find other sources to go along with the play, which is magnificent. But he has a narrative. He has to move the story along, and you can't tell the whole story. And you have to have a protagonist who is palatable for these times. The immigrant, the ardent anti-slavery person, all of those kinds of things that are not real, but nevertheless make him, as I said, someone who's attractive. So history books, that's what you got to do.
Thank you very much.
You're behind me.
I think I may be the last question.
You may be the last one.
I think Lord Nelson, by the way, was also born in Nevis, Battle of Trafalgar. But in any case, the question I have has to do about the correspondence between Jefferson and Abigail. Was there a particular reason that Abigail did not share that information of the correspondence with John? Do you have any insight into that when he found out there was this correspondence? And secondly, did Abigail, in her letters to Jefferson, broach the subject of his personal choices and his lifestyle? Did she try to offer him any advice, particularly after Jefferson was a widower? Did she make any suggestions as to how he could live a more fulfilling life?
Well, the letters that Abigail did not show John were the ones written in 1804. There's no evidence that John didn't know about the correspondence in the 1780s between Abigail and Jefferson. She probably showed him the letters, because there's nothing really, this little flirtation about the Venus is small stuff, and the exchange of gifts and so on. It was, there was nothing serious about it. There's no hanky-panky in their relationship. They both, I mean, he really was in awe of Mrs. Adams, and she says at one point he is one of the choice ones. I mean, she just was very impressed. You had to be impressed by Jefferson. Everybody was impressed by Jefferson. John Quincy has some later, as he gets to be a grown-up, has some doubts about Jefferson, but Jefferson was very charming. I mean, he just was unbelievably knowledgeable about everything. You just couldn't help but be awed by him. I just don't see anything in the only correspondence that John was not privy to was the one in the series of letters in 1804, which escalate, and then she shows John later, and he writes at this note, as Annette pointed out. I just want to note, I was not aware of this correspondence till after it's all over. You had some other question? Was there any?
No, that was it. Thank you very much.
Okay, good.
Thank you very much for remembering. Thanks a lot. And I would like to thank everybody for coming, and Gordon is going to sign some books.